Hello and welcome to this very special edition of LawPod. I'm Peter Doran and I'm joined today by Rosie Cowan. We're talking to Declan Lawn, one of the writers of the hit series Blue Lights. Declan, thank you very much for joining us for this LawPod, this special Blue Lights edition of LawPod. I've been looking forward to this opportunity to speak to you for some time. As a graduate of the School of Law, as someone who has a really interesting take on law because of your studies and your experience of law, I thought it would be really interesting to get a sense of your career, your life, and your thoughts through the prism of the law and your experience of the law, both as a professional journalist and now as a screenwriter. Could we begin with some reflections on your life growing up in Northern Ireland and any early hints that you were destined to write as a core practice?
So, well, thanks for having me. It's good to be back here. I graduated from here in 2017. We had just, the law school had just moved into this new building then. So it's good to see it in action. But I had a great time here. I did the Master's in Legal Science. Took me 4 years, I think it was 4, to complete it, because I was working at the time. But yeah, I think, growing up had a bit of a dichotomy in me between creative writing and journalism. And to an extent, I think that played out all my life, really. So I think I was always, as a kid, a reader. I remember writing a play in school in primary 3, and they actually put it on for the school. So, and I still remember that feeling of being like 7 or 8 years old, going, there's people acting out my words and absolutely loving it. Did the same thing again in primary 7. And then as I got into my teen years, so I think there's a commonality in the interest. So I was both interested in kind of very, very curious about how the world worked and how people worked. And that, I suppose, is the essential dichotomy I was in. One kind of led me towards journalism, and one made me want to write creatively. So I, big reader all through. I went to St. Louis Grammar School in Ballymena. Loved reading. English was without a doubt my favorite subject. Knew I wanted to study it in college, but was also and had aspirations to write stuff. Although in my teen years I didn't write anything, and that continued right through. So basically, I go to Trinity in Dublin, study English. Absolutely love it. 4 of the best years of my life. I just felt like I was finally doing the one thing I'd always wanted to do. But by then, I was definitely drawn towards journalism. So I can remember as a teenager, every Tuesday night, sitting up with my dad and watching Spotlight. We used to watch that together. And I'd be reading the papers, and I can remember several things happening as a teenager that really drew me towards journalism. The way sometimes you remember the most random things in life, but they seem quite seminal. One of them was a report from an ITN reporter, must have been about 1987. His name was Sandy Gall. I think he's still alive, actually. I think he's in his late 90s, if I'm not mistaken. But Sandy Gall was in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen as they were planning to attack like a Russian military convoy. And he was in, essentially, they were trying not to identify where he was. I was watching this going, well, you're actually allowed to do this? Like, this seemed like the best life ever. And I used to follow, journalists like Jon Snow when he was at ITN and stuff, and just thinking, okay, that's the life for me. But there was always a dichotomy there. So when I went to Trinity, I did my primary degree. And then afterwards, I did a master's in Anglo-Irish literature. And I guess it came to a point when I was about 23, 24, when I had this choice to make between, and I think the choice was probably between academia and leaving to pursue journalism. And I remember another moment sitting in the Oscar Wilde Centre at Trinity on a Tuesday morning. I remember that, and the sun was coming in, the big Georgian windows. and I was in a seminar about Beckett, and I remember being about 24 and looking out the window and thinking, I think I have to get out there because my next step here is a PhD, probably going down the English academic route, which I've thought about many times in my life since, what that would have been like. I think I would have been pretty happy doing that. But I just had this compulsion as quite a young man then to say, like, I think I need to get out and see things. And really, it was probably only about 3 weeks after that I saw an ad for reporter in Spotlight in Belfast. I had done a decent amount of journalism in Dublin, like in Trinity News and also Sunday Independent in Dublin, McGill Magazine. I kind of slightly supported myself by doing freelance journalism. And to my total amazement, I got that job. And I think that Tuesday morning was probably around about April. And late September, I was in Eastern Europe, in Lithuania, doing an investigation into people trafficking. And first of all, feeling extraordinarily out of my depth as an investigative journalist. That wasn't my thing, but for some reason they hired me. And then about a year after that, I was in Iraq in September 2003. And it was kind of a case of be careful what you wish for, because there I was, like, surrounded by men with guns who themselves looked pretty nervous as we kind of navigated Basra. I was thinking, yeah, maybe the old English academic route might have been a bit healthier. But I loved it. I loved journalism for a long time. It kind of lived up to all my expectations, really. I got to travel a lot. So started in Spotlight. Within a couple of years, I'd reported on a panorama. And then the rest of my career in the BBC, more or less until the last 18 months, 2 years, was I would do a few panoramas out of Belfast, intersperse those with Spotlight programs. And it was a great life. And yet I always had this itch. I kept trying to start writing short stories and then read them the next day and think this is absolutely dreadful. And it was dreadful. But I always had this itch to be creative. And then, my 30s were objectively crazy, right? So by the time I get to my 30s, I'm thinking, I love journalism, but I'm kind of doing everything I wanted to do in it. And I kept coming up against, and I think coming up against is the right term, law as part of journalism. And I was both intimidated by it and kind of fascinated by it. And I started to see how, probably even more than finance and money, it kind of shaped everything. And I got to the point where the kind of levee broke, and I thought in about 2012, 2013, I had made a couple of programs, in which the law had played quite a big part. And I thought, I think I need to study this. So then I've got a three-way dilemma, like I'm interested in law, writing and journalism. A crazy time indeed.
Tell me more about your experience, your encounter with law as a journalist, why you were drawn to it, and you've developed some interesting views on law. Because it's one thing to talk about how law is codified, and it appears to be about a black and white world, but it's often in the grey areas that we become really captivated by the law and how it's translated or contested in many situations. Just tell me more about your experience and your draw to law as a journalist, because I'd like to go on then and maybe contrast your response to that understanding and that curiosity about the law from the dramatic perspective. But let's stay with the initial interest.
I think that's right, Peter. So curiosity is what it came down to, and a realization during my journalistic career that law was not some rarefied abstract thing. It was dynamic and also could be dangerous, right? I had the sense that it was used by the powerful to completely shape society, and that sometimes a single legislative act could fundamentally change the way we live, right? And you could never quite guess which piece of legislation that was. So let me give you an example of that so you know what I'm talking about. So about 2007, we made a panorama. It was called Subprime Suspect. I think in the UK, we were probably amongst the first mainstream journalists, maybe not the first, but amongst the first to identify a problem with subprime mortgages in the UK. So there had been murmurings and worries across the Atlantic, and we were reading pieces in the New York Times and so on about this problem, repossessions and foreclosures and a dip in the housing market. And my producer at the time was like, I wonder, is that the same here? And he went, as panorama producers do, because basically they're all nerds in the best way possible. He sifted through county court repossession judgments in the UK over the last 4 years. I don't know, it took him weeks sitting at his desk. And he came to the conclusion that the rate of repossessions was absolutely skyrocketing in the previous year to 18 months, like completely off the charts. And we brought this to our editor and said, look, we think we might have the same issue here that they have in America, that people can't pay back their mortgages. They've borrowed too much money. And so we went out and started trying to find some of those people, and we were completely blown away, like totally blown away by it. You know, I remember we found a couple who were probably in their late 60s or 70s on disability benefits, both of them in mobility, scooter, wheelchair things, who had borrowed a vast amount of money from a small independent mortgage broker, had sorted the mortgage. There was just no way on earth with their income they'd be able to repay it. And then we started looking at how that could be, like how that business case worked. And we started getting into collateralized debt obligations, tracing it back to the banks who were ultimately shifting these mortgages onto the global market. And we thought, okay, this is not a problem in Midwest America or the southern states. This is like really serious and potentially global. Now, this is 2007, September, a year before Northern Rock and all that stuff. So we were there going, okay, this is really problematic. And of all of the panoramas I've done, I don't think we've had any more intense legal pushback. So if my memory serves me correctly, Lehman Brothers, who we traced quite a big tranche of the mortgages back to, engaged Carter Rucker Shillings, one of the attack dogs. And we ended up in the final weekend, the show went out on a Monday, we were getting a legal letter every hour, telling us that they were going to sue us and that this was, completely incorrect. We were doing interviews with the Council of British Mortgage Lenders, who were essentially saying to us, nothing to see here, move along, while the factory's burning behind them. And so first of all, we're getting the legal letters, which is quite intimidating. We had an amazing lawyer in Panorama who, funnily enough, was called Roger Law. And the phrase we used to use for Panorama scripts was like, has your script been Rogered yet? Has it been Rogered? That means like, have you sat with Roger for 3 hours and gone through every single line? But Roger on this one was bullish, and he was like, I can't see how they can, argue with facts. And then it became apparent to us as we did more interviews, what was the genesis of all this really? Like, where really did this come from? And the conclusion from a lot of, people who were more economically literate than me was that it was the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act in 1999 by the Clinton administration. I think that act was called Leach, Graham-Bliley or something. But basically, they got rid of that separation between commercial and retail banking, and the kind of 10% reserves you had to have, and everything just went ballistic. And it took about 9 years for it to blow up. And I've always thought since, the world we live in now, I think, Brexit, Trump, the absolute destruction of the middle class through austerity, there's a very strong case to be made that all of this, the world we live in now, the cost of living, everything, comes back essentially to the repeal of one very important piece of legislation, which was a kind of regulatory buffer on total crazy avarice in the financial industry. So that that was a big one for me, thinking about that. And I started to think about the law a lot more. I mean, obviously in Panorama, we came up against people weaponizing law all the time. I did in 2011, maybe 2012, an investigation into Lord Michael Ashcroft and his business dealings in the Turks and Caicos. We actually did 3 of those. There was 3 panoramas. Richard Bilton did 2. I did 1. And again, a lot of legal pressure. It was also really interesting to see how kind of corporate and financial and tax law essentially benefited rich people. You could hide your assets. You could, have an enormously complex global network of companies that no one could get to the bottom of who was controlling them. So, as I say, for me, probably around 2012, the levee broke in terms of my curiosity, because I was a reporter engaging with the law a lot through lawyers around Nick Roger Law and people like him around Panorama. And I thought, I really want to demystify this for myself. I thought lawyers, they were kind of initiates in a secret but necessary band of knowledge that we reporters really, you couldn't question it, and you couldn't. It was quite a rarefied thing, and you just took their advice, and I just thought I would love to get to a position where I just have a little bit more confidence about everything I'm talking about. And so, I mean, literally like one Sunday night. Well, actually, there was, I think about 2011, I talked to my wife about it, and I said, I would really love to do this. And we were talking about not so much the financial cost of doing it here, because that was kind of okay, but it was the time cost. We had 3 or 4 children. So the first year I was interested, but didn't apply. And then it was just like a brainworm for a year, and I kind of wore her down, and eventually we were like, okay, let's do this. It was hard though. Like, we had 3 young children at the time, 4 now, 3 at the time, and I was a full-time journalist, and I was coming here and studying at nights and weekends. But I mean, I'm so glad I did it. It completely changed my life. Unbelievably intellectually stimulating. Completely changed how I looked at the world, as I'd suspected it would. Realized that law was not this kind of abstract, rarefied thing. Like, I think sometimes when the ordinary person on the street thinks of law, the image they have in their mind is a kind of an office with mahogany walls and a nice big desk and bookshelves lined with law books. And you can point at them and go, that's the law, right? There it is. It's over there. If we need to check it, we'll consult it. And of course, like, once you study it, you realize it's a completely dynamic thing. It's an instrument of power. It fundamentally changes the culture. All of the most interesting debates, whether it's, abortion or the rights of trans people, essentially play out in the law courts. That's where the action is. So, yeah, I'm super glad I did it. It was one of the best decisions of my life. Even though obviously I never practiced it, but in the work that I do now, everything I learned there is like front and center, I think. I don't think I could write Blue Lights if I hadn't done this.
Fascinating. Rosie, would you like to come in at this point?
Yeah, it's so interesting because you've had quite a parallel journey to my own. Yeah, you've had a similar journey. Yeah, through studying English and creative writing, journalism and law. I'd like to ask you really about the inspiration then for Blue Lights, because, if you're like me, you probably grew up watching, I don't know, cop shows. Yeah. Did you maybe? Or was there anything there? And then coming at it from, having studied law, what was the inspiration and how did that shape the show?
So on the cop shows, absolutely I always loved television. Hill Street Blues, NYPD Blue when I was at college in the 90s. Watched it every single week. And then The Wire, which was early noughties. So I was a journalist at that time. And I could have and still can just continuously watch The Wire. If I ever catch it on.
It's a great show.
If I ever catch it, I'm just like, I'm watching it.
And written by a former journalist as well, David Simon. Yeah.
He spent a year with the homicide department of the Baltimore police.
Yeah.
So there was something about The Wire where it seemed to me like Simon seemed to me like a modern day Dickens, like the the sprawl of what he was trying to say, painting a picture of a city.
Absolutely.
I kind of forgotten post-industrial backwater of the States. And basically it wasn't a cop show, was it? He was interrogating the American dream and what it had come to. And so that for me was a massive influence on Blue Lights, like just massive. The influence really. Stylistically, I think Hill Street Blues is probably a big influence, but in terms of what we're trying to do, The Wire was massive. And so the inspiration for Blue Lights, funnily enough, I work with a guy called Adam Patterson. The kernel of the idea didn't come from us. So what happened was we had made a show, our first show ever, after many years of writing scripts, almost like a hobby. No, maybe not a hobby. I mean, we eventually got an agent and we had aspirations, but it's a very difficult business to get into. But we did finally get a show commissioned in 2019 called The Salisbury Poisonings, which went out in 2020, about the Novichok attacks on Sergei Skripal and his daughter and others in Salisbury. And that show went down really well. So the Salisbury Poisonings went out during lockdown, towards the end of lockdown and COVID. I think there were resonances about it that really appealed to people. It was about a small group of kind of civil servants trying to contain a contagion. It was about, there was lockdown in it. There was like real human drama in it. So that show, our first show, did super well. It got massively inflated audiences, as did all shows during lockdown, because there was nothing else to do. So I think it was up around 10 million or something. It's crazy. And after that, the BBC were quite well disposed to Adam and I, because we were both former journalists, and they were kind of saying to us, look, if you have anything else, let us know first. So it was kind of that kind of vibe where we thought, if we push at this door, we'll get something else. And just around that time, we were making a short film, very low budget short film with a producer here called Louise Gallagher. Now, Louise had a friend who left social work to become a police officer, close friend, and Louise watched their transition from civilian social worker to police probationer for 2 or 3 years. And she met us one day and she says, there's something amazing in this. Like, this is like the change in her and the things she comes up against. Even for a social worker who has seen it all, this was a massive dramatic transition in life. And she said to us, do you think you'd ever be interested in doing a cop show set here? Because no one has done a cop show about response officers in a long time, maybe since Hill Street Blues. And initially we were very trepidatious about it. Our own place in our own time, and the police, which is a highly politicized issue. So initially we were like, I don't know, Louise, it's a big thing to bite off. It's a political minefield. As soon as you say there's a show about the PSNI, our opinion was there's going to be an entire section of the community who are like, well, we're not going to watch it then. And not only we're not going to watch it, we're not going to like it. But what happened was Louise said, okay, take your point, but I know 3 response officers in the police. So would you just sit down with them and talk to them over a week? And if at the end of the week you think not for us, that's fine. We'll go our separate ways and I'll look for someone else. And we did. And by the Friday night, Adam and I were just like, we have to make this, because it was an incredible, the theme that we identified in that week and that has stayed with Blue Lights forever is idealism versus pragmatism. So you have these people out there, many of them genuinely get into it because they want to make the world a better place. And then they come up against the incredible, oppressive, bureaucratic pragmatism of trying to police a place with not that many resources, a creaky justice system that often works against the concept of natural justice. And then also the kind of constant trauma that you're exposed to. So anyway, by the Friday night, Adam and I were like, you know what? life is short. This is, we've got a chance here to pitch a show about our home place. We loved The Wire, and we were like, let's give it a whirl.
And you're giving a hint there that it's as much character-driven as plot-driven.
Oh, it's totally character-driven.
The journey of the social worker, obviously, marrying Grace, and
honestly, it's plot is very secondary, right? Now, people have said that the plot is works quite well and weaves quite well together, and that the plot strands all cohere at the end. But the only reason that happens is because we write to character arcs. Yeah. So, to give you an example, in the very first writer's room for Blue Lights, Adam and I always knew we wanted to be character writers. That's what interested us. Actually, the reason we left investigative journalism was we would go and do a panorama documentary or spotlight or whatever. We would meet someone who was just amazing, had the most incredible story, and we'd interview them for an hour and a half.
I can relate to that.
And we'd use 90 seconds of their story because you're not there to excavate a character's story, or even really, sometimes you engage the emotions almost by accident if it's a really powerful story. But that's not why you're there to hold power to account. So Adam and I, after years of leaving these stories on the cutting room floor, we were like, God, that's the thing that's really interesting. I mean, this is all important, but how can we meet all these people and never ever? So that's why we got into writing. But so as soon as we started Blue Lights, we were like, right, this is a character show. This is what it is. And we ran a writer's room. We got in like 5 or 6 local writers, and it was just a week long. It was just to kind of stimulate some ideas. And on Monday morning, we were like, okay, let's talk about our main characters. Adam and I already had them in mind, Grace, the idealist, Stevie, the pragmatist, Jerry, the guy who's seen it all, Tommy, the naive young man, and Annie, the kind of sparky, tough, but like unpolished diamond. So we knew all that. And then we spent the week talking about them and where we would like to bring them over a season or maybe 2 seasons. I think it was about 2 or 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon when everyone was about to go to the airport or get their train. Somebody said, but what happens in the show? And we were like, don't worry about that. That'll sort itself out. And it did. It does. Like every time we go to write a season, our office, which is very close to here, actually, if you went in there, there's a blackboard about this, or a whiteboard about the size of this wall. And we just have all the names of the characters down the side and their character arcs. What happens to them, how they change, how they evolve until we get to ep 6. And then it's true, the old cliche is true. If you get character right, plot looks after itself. Yeah.
And it's just bringing to mind something that David Simon said about The Wire, that you can maybe tell more of the truth through fiction than through journalism. I mean, would you endorse that, or how would you see that view of the world?
I completely concur with the idea that in fiction you can probably tell more truth. I think we have said things in Blue Lights about Northern Ireland, maybe about the world, that if you were to say them in journalism, they would be much more constrained and balanced and impartial and have the emotional heft taken out of them. So let's say an example in season 2 is the Legacy Act and the legacy case we investigate to do with Jen and Happy Kelly. So you can put opinions in the mouths of characters and see them deeply emotionally affected by things that, if I was making a spotlight about that, I would say the victims say this. Here's a government spokesman who says this. No qualitative difference between the two, totally impartial. Whereas in Blue Lights, you can really dig down into and again, it comes back to the law, the real human emotional import of legislative decisions and how they completely shape the present and the future. And in many ways, I mean, I think Blue Lights is, like my whole journalistic career, is kind of almost an interpretation of a piece of legislation, the Good Friday Agreement. That was the idealist bit, and everything since has been the pragmatic bit. And that's kind of
I mean, obviously the show's very much informed by your journalistic experience and your knowledge, and but yet you're not beating the viewer over the head with the police procedural aspect. Was that something you consciously thought about, or was that something that just came about through the writing?
So we don't want to beat the viewer over the head with anything, and in particular the kind of vagaries of Northern Ireland politics. I could be wrong about this, but I don't think we have ever used a 3-letter acronym for a paramilitary group. We've never said UVF, UDA, IRA, Real. I don't think so, right? Mm-hmm. So our whole point, the whole kind of point of Blue Lights, is to make a human character drama set in a very interesting context, quite a unique context for policing, but we don't see ourselves as there to say to an English, Scottish, Welsh, or international audience, these are the issues you need to be thinking about, because nobody wants to watch that. It has to be entertaining. And then by proxy, you can explore all sorts of stuff. As long as it's entertaining and it matters to your characters, it'll matter to the viewer. So for instance, the legacy case thing in season 2, a lot of people in England responded to that saying, I had no idea our government was doing this. I don't really pay attention to Northern Ireland. I had no idea. We were closing down everything to do with the past. And it stimulated a bit of conversation with viewers. So yes, I suppose the bottom line is we try very hard not to be didactic, very, very hard, and to put kind of character and entertainment first.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And then, you know, without even trying to, like
it started a conversation.
Yeah, but it's a distillation. Like the show's a distillation of everything Adam and I have gone through in our lives as journalists and people growing up. And I'm 47, he's 42, so a wee bit younger. So I was 22 when the Good Friday Agreement was signed. He would have been 17. But I mean, his dad was a prison officer. You know, they had a gun in the house, bulletproof windows, all that stuff. Mm-hmm. So he brings a lot to it, and you know, I bring my stuff to it.
You think some of the references, you know, like the references to Box and Circus for MI5 and 6, you know, will go over a lot of the viewers' heads, but it still gives that kind of authenticity.
Yes, totally.
You were careful around that as well.
Yeah. So all of those things, you know, Box and Debt and Sneaky Beakies and all, were phrases that I would have been familiar with as a journalist. And
me, yeah.
Yes, yeah. And we had a conversation at the very beginning with the BBC where we said, we're not going to make any compromises whatsoever. There's going to be tons of assumed knowledge in this. Mm-hmm. In terms of vernacular and how people speak.
It's kind of another parallel with The Wire, where David Simon said he wasn't going to educate his audience before he...
Totally, because I think as soon as you start trying to do that, the magic of the drama is lost. People realize, like, audiences are smart. My takeaway from the last 6 years is basically
that
audiences are audiences are
Mm-hmm.
super clever. So as soon as you start saying we're going to water down the language, or we're not going to refer to MI5 as Box or Sneaky Beakies, we'll refer to them as MI5 so people know who they are. As soon as you start doing that, you lose some magic.
No.
So we said to the BBC at the start, like, we are not going to compromise on any language. We're going to assume loads of knowledge on the behalf of the audience. And if they want to find something out, they can Google it. And, you know, people like it. They don't mind it. They really don't. Even in places like New Zealand and Australia where it's done well. I've been on a couple of podcasts there talking about the show, and it doesn't put people off. But I'm the same. Like, all the stuff I love is hyper local. Like, you know, I think if you start writing for a global international audience, you're dead.
Oh, totally agree. Peter, I wonder, do you want to come back there?
It's character driven, but the continuity that you've brought over from the observations of the law and your experience of the law in journalism, the continuity is that you're still exploring power. Power and the structures are there as kind of spectres rather than in a very obvious way.
Totally.
In Blue Lights, isn't that correct?
Yeah, I think that's what I'm most interested in all my life, is power and how it works and who it works for. And And then the realization, I suppose, that the law can be an instrument of power, and can disempower people. So what's at the very heart of Blue Lights is the difference between the law as an ideal and the pragmatism of its execution because of really bad resourcing, both of the police and the criminal justice system. So let's take an example. At the very beginning of series 2, there's a guy in a pharmacy kind of losing it with the pharmacist, being threatening, on the edge of criminal behavior. And Annie decides, we're not going to arrest you. And the reason she does that is not a kind of decision about his behavior, because the day before, the day after, she probably would have. It's because all of the cells in Belfast are full. Like 53 cells are full. And so she's thinking, she's thinking a year into the job, okay, if I arrest him, I'm going to Coleraine or Strabane, and I'm going to be there all day. And we only have 3 call signs on the ground, and this is going to be one of them removed for the rest of the shift. So to me, that kind of thing is really, really interesting because, again, the whole show is about idealism versus pragmatism. So it's about the things you would do in a perfect world versus the things you have to do in a very flawed and imperfect world. And that you'll see that right through Blue Lights, where they're amazed that someone's got out on bail sometimes. It's like, this guy just beat up a cop. How's he out on bail? The police themselves are mystified by the workings of the criminal justice system, and what it essentially comes down to is resources. Like the impossibility of the way that the system works sometimes affronts natural law, in my opinion. Like say if a rape case takes four years to go to trial, and you have a defendant saying, well, I honestly can't remember. I mean, it's 4 years ago. You're going to have a jury saying, well, I had some sympathy for this defendant here because, yeah, it's 4 years. This is, and the reason it took 4 years is simply a practical issue, not a legal one. So yeah, all of that stuff is at the heart of Blue Lights.
An interesting dimension we've talked about is you're in a very privileged and unusual position of seizing the imaginations, the interests of viewers in England, Scotland, and Wales in particular, and I suppose famously or infamously, Northern Ireland and all its dilemmas and complexities is rarely a priority per se. So you're able to convey things that have not possibly been conveyed in their nuance through Blue Lights. Are you aware of that? And have you had any feedback that suggests that some of that is landing?
Yes, I think I'm aware of reaction from the rest of the UK and America and Australia, that people are kind of having their eyes opened a little bit about how things are here. Yeah, I think we are aware of that. People seem quite engaged by it, but the key thing for us is just the key thing for us is really the characters. So the old BBC maxim of inform, educate, and entertain. I think if you're making drama, entertain has to come first. And the way that it comes first always is character. So I just think people generally are drawn to complexity, and still today, the most complex thing in the world is a person, until AI exceeds us. But for now, a complex character is the way to bring people back to the next episode and the episode after that, like always.
Yes. The form of the drama, the fact-based or fact-informed drama, you've also reflected on the particular power of that format and even its influence in the case of Mr. Bates and the legal impact.
Factual drama is in a very interesting place.
Yes, especially in the context of of information overload, fragmented post-truth, that your particular form has it has a particular moment given the larger attention economy.
So if you separate off, first of all, for a moment, right, pure factual drama, like, say, the Salisbury poisonings that we made, The Sixth Commandment, Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, there have been many Chernobyl over the last 5 or 6 years, and many of them have landed hugely. Like Mr. Bates, I mean, unheard of for a television drama to prompt a change in legislation 2 weeks later. I mean, it's astonishing. And I've given a lot of thought as to what it is. What is it about factual drama, as distinct from Blue Lights? Because Blue Lights is fiction with a factual background. You know, Blue Lights is authentic, I would say, but not factual. But the Salisbury poisonings was factual drama. And what is it about, what's making these dramas land so hard? And the best thing that I can work out is that we're subject today, in any given day, to like massive sensory and information overload. Stories that should engage us emotionally, and that we're aware rationally, this should engage my emotions. But you're scrolling through Twitter and you're seeing an horrific scene from somewhere in the world, and you're like, you feel secretly really bad, because at a certain point you're like, I am now becoming immune to this, right? And you see all of this horror and you think, I can't be this person who's not. And what factual drama does is it opens up a space where it says two things. It says, give us like 3 or 4 hours of your life. We're going to tell you a story that is true. Now, there's another little debate around about that, which we can talk about, is, you know, how true is it? But let's assume that the audience buy into the fact that the producers have done their research and this is true, right? At least in an emotional sense, it's true. And no one's going to argue with the basic fact. We've done our research. We spent like 2 years researching this. We've identified the salient points of this case and this drama, and we're going to show it to you now. And you're allowed to be emotionally engaged. You're allowed to be sad or angry or overwhelmed, and it's like an incredible emotional safety valve for people, where people can, you know, look at the end of the Salisbury poisonings and see the real families and, you know, become very emotional about it, or look at Mr. Bates and become like incredibly angry at like absolute, you know, corporate incompetence and malfeasance and so on. And so factual drama is basically saying you don't get this anywhere else. And in fact, the guilt that you feel for not having time to be emotionally engaged with all of the horror in the world is, you can assuage it here. That's my kind of random speculative theory. But I think like there must be some fundamental reason in the culture, some cultural gap that explains why factual drama is landing so heavily right now. And I think it's just people are just emotionally overloaded and exhausted, and they want a place to experience that.
Absolutely. I wanted to take you back to the way in which you've brought a journalistic rigor to your practice in terms of you know, the collaborative, the workshopping, the work that you do with the advisors and others to bring a raw screenplay that begins in its first draft, and then through dialogue and responses and workshopping, it becomes something different. Can you walk through that and just give us a taste of the work of a screenwriter? Because obviously, just as some of us have misperceptions about the law, we sometimes imagine that the screenwriter is sitting in the attic for 6 months, but it's actually a very collaborative, social,
extraordinarily
enterprise.
So. I mean, I assume there are screenwriters out there who sit in the garden shed or the attic, and maybe that is possible. But I know that Adam and I can't do it. It's not how we work. It's not how we'll ever work. So basically, for us, the first stage is research. So the research stage lasts like several months, and in that we meet loads of police officers with no real agenda. We just sit down and talk to people. Some of it is organised officially through the PSNI, who are cooperative and pretty helpful. I would say we have a kind of an arm's length, cordial relationship with them. They never inquire as to what we're writing about. They never ask. They never put any pressure on us in that regard. And if they did, I would say, sorry, that's none of your business. But I do think they realize that if you're going to make a show about us, you should probably get some things right. So to an extent, they open up, allow us to talk to some officers, but then, and we do it informally as well. So say, for example, this afternoon, I'm going to meet a police officer, a response officer, to talk about her life and career. And it's very open-ended. It's just literally not much of an agenda, as I say. I just say, why did you join the police? How did you join the police? How did you find your first year? What's the worst call you've ever been to? What's the funniest call you've ever been to? Just the usual kind of just general. And those people will always inevitably say something that sparks a creative thing. And they themselves might not even realize what they've said that has kind of lit a little fire in my mind or in Adam's mind. So, for example, a phrase that has now become a part of the Blue Lights lexicon is take a beat. So we were sitting with a police officer who was telling us all about his life, and, we were chatting to him for like hours, and he just said, oh no. So we went into the house and they, I have to take a beat. And I was like, what do you mean? What does that mean? He goes, oh no, you always take a beat. Like you don't rush into a house. You spend a few seconds assessing to see, is there a threat here? Is there what's behind that curtain? Is there, no matter how bad the thing is in front of you, you spend 5 or 6 seconds just going, okay, what's going on here? Is it safe for me to? So we took that and put it in Jerry's mouth, and it's become a kind of, people say it in the show now all the time. A lot of people are starting to say it in real life. I say it a lot in real life. But so that's an example. Sometimes when we're talking to police officers, it's not the things that they think they're telling us that we're going, that's really interesting. Some of it we've heard before. Some of it we think, oh, it's not. Sometimes they tell us stuff that's literally too ridiculous and insane and unbelievable. That I sometimes say to them, look, if I put that in the show,
truth is stranger than fiction.
Fire me as a writer. They'd be like, you've jumped the shark. But so the research stage lasts several months. It's very enjoyable and also kind of frightening and intimidating. And that by the end of that, you've got so much information on paper and in your head. So I never take notes when I'm meeting them because I think that kind of puts a little distance. If I'm sitting there going, they think I'm a journalist. And I always say to them, I'm not a journalist anymore. I just want to have a chat with you. But then after they leave, whatever the 5 or 6 things are that were most interesting, I'll scribble them down. So that lasts for a long time. Then you get to a point before you put a shape on it where you're very intimidated by all the information you have in your head. You're just like, how on earth am I going to, look at this, and this in the next season? But once you start writing, like once you actually start putting fingers on keyboards, there's a certain amount of magic happens. You discard a lot of things, you pursue a lot of things, and then you find connections, kind of felicitous connections between things that you didn't think were connected. You think, oh, well, actually, this story here could not just affect her, but it could also have an effect on, that's just the kind of magic that happens when you're writing. So research stage is great. The 2 weeks before you start writing are horrendous. You just think, no. You always think, can't do this again. Can't do it again. It's impossible. It can't be done again. And then you start and you realize, no, it's okay. It's going to be fine. And then throughout the process of writing, you always have 3 or 4 moments which are necessary where you go, no, we're doomed. This is a disaster. And you think the level of work is just too overwhelming and so on. And then, so the most important thing to know about screenwriters for anyone who wants to do it is screenwriting is the most collegiate art form in the world. I think apart from playing music in a band, there's nothing else where so many other people have a say in it. And the best screenwriters, I think, are people who are able to assimilate and accommodate other people's opinions where they're right. You can't roll over on everything, otherwise you're writing by committee. But the simple fact of the matter that I've found is that people who've spent their careers in production companies as story editors or producers who have made loads of shows, most of their ideas are good. Like 80% of them are good. And 20% of them you have to say, no, I'm going to die on this hill. Like, I don't like that. But, it's an incredibly, it's just an incredibly collegiate way to work. So you have the production company executives, you have BBC executives. So we're meeting constantly, like, once a week when we're in the weeds, when we're in the thick of the writing, like every Friday, they're reading that week's draft, saying, I'm not sure about this. I don't like this. I don't like this. You have it out or not. And then you go on to the next draft, maybe 40 or 50 drafts of each episode, just constant changing and updating. So yeah, that's kind of how it works. It's, the story is told several times in the scripting. It's told in the shoot when you're directing it. We directed on season 2. You find all sorts of things in the room in the moment where, actors have an idea or, just the scene just plays differently or you think, what if we actually do it a little bit differently? And then in the edit, everybody always underestimates the edit. They think it's just putting jigsaw pieces in a jigsaw, and the edit is one of the most fundamental storytelling places. I mean, you can change the tenor of a scene, change the import of it, change the tone of it. The power of the edit is extraordinary. Like, from your first kind of rough assembly to the final cut is, a good editor changes everything. So that's how it works, basically. It's hard work, can be stressful, but you just have to remind yourself that, without in any way demeaning what you're doing, you have to say, well, in this case, it's not actually life and death. The real police who are out there and emergency services and fire services and people, doctors, nurses, that is actually life and death. This isn't life and death, so let's just, take a beat.
Can you give it any sense of where, I think you have 2 new series commissioned. You have
3 and 4, yeah.
3 and 4. Without spoilers or, going into the detail, are there new directions or surprises or arcs that you're going to explore? Especially bearing in mind that you're trying to do something quite nuanced and you're coming from a journalistic intention as well.
Some things are going to be the same in that the show's always going to be about, our main characters. Like, I think the aspiration is to show what, the very conception and kernel of the show was about how a person changes by coming to work in the police. And I think that ideally it'll chart the first few years of these officers' lives and see how they change as people. But in terms of story and stuff, I mean, all I can say is I'm very interested in the kind of professional apparatus around organized crime, lawyers, accountants, that kind of stuff, which is a real issue. People knowingly laundering money and, so there's going to be a bit of that going forward. There'll be a couple of new characters coming in. But these characters who we already know, I want them to be at the heart of it always and just see how they grow and change and fall and break and all that kind of stuff.
I wanted to take you back to the biographical because at the time that you were, I think, emerging from the legal studies, you then began to make decisions about moving out of journalism, a kind of a leap into this passion for writing and becoming a screenwriter. You've linked that to the loss of your father, for example. Just I find those experiences interesting, and sometimes those are the moments when we gather a lot of courage to follow our passion. Can you just reflect a little bit on that?
Yeah, like my father died at 57 from cancer 15 years ago. I was 32, and he was also called Jerry, actually, and a bit like in the show where the other characters are initially destroyed by Jerry's death, but then start to grow from it. I think that's kind of what happened to me. So I had a real shock, that sense of coming, being close to the idea of mortality and seeing someone who, relatively young, die in that way, gave me, if you excuse the language, like a kick in the arse. I just thought, not immediately, but over the next 2 years, I thought to myself, God, life is short, and, you're not going to have infinite time to write the book or write the screenplay or pursue the thing you're interested in. But the thing I think the first thing that it pushed me into was the law degree. I thought, why have something in your mind that you're interested in and curious about, but you're not, basically it stopped me saying, I'm going to do this in my 40s, when life's a bit easier. Because I probably would have said, someday I'll do that. But instead, I just said, no, I'm going to do it. And similarly with the writing, so I think when I was doing my law degree, I probably had it in the back of my mind that I was going to be a lawyer. Because even though Adam and I were doing some writing together, it wasn't, I'm not sure it ever felt really realistic. Like Adam and I would have meetings all the time and we were like, we should just stop this, shouldn't we? I mean, it's taking up a bit of time and, we're both really busy and, but the Salisbury poisonings did happen. And that kind of changed everything. But I think probably by now, if that had never happened, would I have moved into law? I might have, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I probably would have. But yes, so my father's death definitely had a kind of a profound psychological impact on me, as well as, the immediate grief of it. Without a doubt, it kind of lit a fire under me and made me get busy to the point of probably being a bit frenetic. I mean, I said at the start of this podcast, my 30s were crazy. I mean, I can't believe that my wife put up with me. So I was doing this. I was trying to do a bit of screenwriting. I got quite heavily into running. I ran 4 marathons in 2 years or something. And looking back, we were actually talking about this a few weeks ago. I was like, how did you put up with me? Because clearly this was like a grief response. It was like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. But we had 3 kids and, I just don't know how she put up with me at all. But I remember gradually things started to settle down. I remember in terms of the running, for example, the last marathon I did was Rome, and I remember crossing the finishing line and looking at the blue banner and going, I'm done. And I don't mean in a physical way. I meant in a spiritual way. It's whatever it was I'm running from, it's time to stop running. Not that running's a bad thing. I still try and do it now and again. But yeah, it was a crazy time. But that all came from that experience, 100%. Just a frenetic, mad response to say I want to have everything.
Seize the day.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe seizing the day too much. Seizing the day a little bit too much, I think. Yeah.
You just to finish, you tell a wonderful story about Kurt Vonnegut about the leap into to writing, and I think it says something about your practice. And I'd love you just to tell that story as well, and just what it means to you.
So I. Apart from those plays I wrote in Primary 3 and Primary 7, I never really seriously wrote creatively again until I was about 37, 38. It was the first time and it was kind of Adam who spurred me into it. He was like, let's write a short film. And it was the first thing I'd written since. And everyone who read it liked it. And then from that moment on, I was writing a lot. So just finished in the law degree, was back doing journalism, but was really now quite constantly coming up with ideas and writing and not feeling when I read them back that they were entirely callow and, worthless. And I remember thinking that some kind of valve had been removed, whether it was a lack of confidence or whatever it was that was holding me back. And I remember thinking, that's it now. No matter what happens, I'm always going to write. And I know with absolute certainty that if I never had any material success in screenwriting, I would still be writing. Maybe screenplays, short stories, whatever. But once I started writing, and a couple of people had said this is good, and then I read around the same time a letter from Kurt Vonnegut that made me, the novelist, that made me think that is exactly what I'm talking about. That's exactly it. The sense that once you start writing, if you aspire to be a writer, if that's kind of in you, once you start writing, and non-writers don't understand this, because non-writers think it has to be about getting the novel published or the screenplay on air. Writers understand something different, which is there is something profound about just doing it that actually completely changes your life, totally and utterly changes your life. So Kurt Vonnegut, you can Google it. It's called Letter to Miss Lockwood's Class. And he starts by saying, Dear Miss Lockwood's class, there's a junior high class in Ohio somewhere who have invited him to come and talk to them as an author. And he says, look, I'm in my 80s now, and I'm not really able to move around very well. But instead of coming to talk to your class, I'm going to set you some homework. So I'd like you to go home tonight and write a 12-line poem in rhyming couplets about anything you want, but I want you to spend time on it and make it really, really good. Best poem you've ever written. And then as soon as you've finished writing it, I want you to read it and enjoy it, and then tear it up and throw it in the bin, and don't bring it to school. And he said, in the writing of that poem, you will have experienced what we call becoming. Like your soul will have grown. And this is the most important thing about writing. It's not the other people who read it. It's becoming. And I remember reading that going, yeah, that's exactly what I'm experiencing right now, which is this sense of like, I can go home at night and write something that interests me. And while success would be nice, and it is nice because the main thing that's nice about it is it gives you the financial ability to just keep writing during office hours. Otherwise you're doing it at night and at weekends. But even if you're only doing it at night and weekends and you're writing short stories and you're sending them to magazines or publishers and no one's biting, every time I see someone approach me with a screenplay or a story or whatever it is, I'm like, you're doing it, you're on the path. And that is like 80% of the battle, is just being on the path and doing it. And as I say, people who don't want to be writers don't get that. But I mean, every single writer listening to this will understand what I'm talking about.
Declan Lawn, thank you very much for sharing your insights and your path.
Thank you. Well, yeah. I had a great few years here. Amazing teachers, amazing fellow students. To say, like, one of the best decisions I've ever made was studying law here. So if I had one message to the university, it'd be that please, for the love of God, don't ever get rid of that kind of ability for older people or mid-career people to study law here and to kind of fraction it out over 3 or 4 or 5 years if they need to. Because that's such a gift for people to have, even if they never go on to practice. I just hope they never get rid of that, because it was wonderful.
Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks very much. That was great.
Thank you very much. Yeah. I enjoyed that.